In 1877, high in the Sierra Nevada, while other settlers stacked logs for winter, Brian was inside a hollow sequoia, carving a staircase by hand. The lightning-struck giant was 300 feet tall, its charred cavity vast as a house. Everyone called him a fool, but he saw a home with walls 10 feet thick, a sanctuary that would one day shelter drifters and become the seed of a town named after the tree. No one believed a man could live inside a burned-out tree trunk, let alone build a life there. Brian was a hardened frontiersman who saw a thousand-year-old sequoia shell as shelter no blizzard could breach. He wasn't just carving stairs, he was carving a future. The question wasn't whether the tree would hold his weight. It was whether it could hold a dream big enough to anchor an entire settlement. And when the first mountain winter roared in, the people who'd mocked him would learn why his hollow tower was soon called the safest place in the Sierra. Brian first saw the burned sequoia in the late autumn of 1875, after 3 days of walking through Sierra pine with nothing but a pack mule and a dog that never left his heel. Other men would have looked at the charred, hollowed trunk and seen a dead thing, a giant killed by lightning, split nearly to its core, the inside blackened and cavernous. Brian looked at it and saw walls nobody could knock down. The tree was a coast redwood's bigger cousin, a Sequoia gigantea, nearly 300 feet tall, with a base so wide you could have parked 2 wagons side by side inside it. The fire that had followed the lightning strike years earlier had carved out a vertical chamber rising 60 feet from the ground, as wide as a cabin. The tree was still alive above, still growing new needles, and the bark around the wound was 10 feet thick in places, a natural fortress. Brian climbed inside that first afternoon, stood in the Cathedral of Char, and listened. The wind outside howled through the canyon, but in here it was muffled, distant. He lit a small fire on the ash floor, and the smoke drew straight up the hollow chimney like it had been built for exactly that purpose. That night he slept inside the tree for the first time, while his dog lay across his feet and the Sierra stars peered down through a jagged opening high above. By the next morning he had already swung his axe against a fallen limb. He wasn't building a cabin. He was carving a staircase. Most men who stake a claim build outward, log walls, sod roofs, fences against the wild. Brian's idea was vertical. He would carve steps into the living inner wood, spiraling up the walls of the cavity, leading to a second floor, then a third, until he had a home stacked in 3 levels inside the trunk. Storage below, a bed and hearth in the middle, a watch post at the very top where a man could see the whole valley. The work required tools that hadn't been designed for such a job. He used a short-handled adze, a 2-inch chisel, and a mallet made from a locust branch. Every step had to be chopped from the dense, fibrous heartwood, and the wood, even though it was dead inside, was harder than any pine he'd ever split. Weeks turned into months. The sound of steel biting sequoia echoed across the canyon, and it was that sound that first let the rest of the world know something strange was happening on the North Ridge. The nearest settlement, a gold rush camp turned supply town called Mill Flat, sat 8 miles down the canyon. By spring of 1876, word had spread that a crazy man was building a house inside a burnt matchstick. Ranchers heading to higher pastures would stop their horses and stare at the smoke curling from the top of the sequoia. Some laughed outright. A freighter named Elias Taggart, who had hauled cargo over the Sierra for 20 winters, pulled his wagon to a stop one morning and squinted up at the dark spire with an expression of pure disbelief. "Boy," he called out after spotting Brian at the entrance, "you know what happens to a hollow tree in a windstorm? It splits like kindling. One good gust and that whole thing comes down on you like a coffin lid." Brian didn't answer. He simply retreated back inside and resumed chiseling. Taggart shook his head, spat into the dirt, and rolled on. That night in the Mill Flat saloon, he told everyone that Brian was building his own grave, nice and gradual, and the name stuck. The Tree Man became a local joke, a cautionary tale told to children, a punchline for men who fancied themselves sensible. But Brian was not completely alone. A young Paiute Indian named Como, who sometimes traded at Mill Flat, had seen the sequoia before the fire. He knew that older tribes had used large hollow trees as winter shelters for generations, though never anything this ambitious. Como rode up one afternoon and studied the work in silence. He didn't laugh. He walked the perimeter of the tree, touched the bark with his palm, and then looked at the staircase emerging from the char. "The wood remembers fire," he said quietly. "It won't burn easy again." Then he pointed to the thick outer bark. "And this is warmer than any tent." That was the extent of the conversation, but it was enough. Como would return weeks later with a bundle of dried deer meat and no questions. It was the first crack in the wall of mockery surrounding the tree. By the second winter, Brian had finished the lower storage platform and was halfway up the second level. He had moved his entire camp inside. A small cast-iron stove, a bedroll, sacks of flour and beans, a lantern that hung from a root snag. The temperatures dropped so low that water in his canteen froze solid inside his coat pocket, but inside the Sequoia, with a small fire burning and the massive bark insulating like a stone fortress, the cold struggled to reach him. That was when he noticed something remarkable. While the rest of the Sierra snowpack drifted 4 and 5 feet deep against cabins and buried wagons, the snow around the Sequoia's base never piled against the entrance. The current that funneled through the canyon was deflected by the tree's sheer bulk, creating a pocket of still air on its leeward side. Nature had already designed a buffer zone. Brian simply had to carve a home inside it. Word of this miracle tree began to shift from ridicule to curiosity. A few older trappers, men who had lost toes and fingers to Sierra winters, came to look. They saw the staircase, the stovepipe running out a knothole, the dog curled comfortably on a bed of pine needles. One of them, a fur trader named Harlan Cotter, muttered, "I've slept in worse barns." But the real test was coming. In the high country, winter is a patient hunter. It waits for a man to make a mistake. And Brian had made one. While carving a window-like observation hole near the top, he had removed too much material from a crucial load-bearing section of the inner wall. When a sudden ice storm coated the tree in a quarter-inch of frozen rain, the stress caused a hairline crack to propagate down the inside of the chamber. Brian heard it in the dead of night, a sound like a rifle shot, then a low, grinding groan from the wood around him. His dog whined. The candle flame flickered as if a ghost had passed through the room. Brian climbed the half-finished staircase with a torch and found a fissure, thin as a thread, running from the upper window to the middle platform. The whole structure could weaken if the crack widened. He had to reinforce it, and soon. The next morning, with the storm still raging, Brian scavenged iron straps from an abandoned wagon wheel he had found in the canyon years earlier. He spent the following 3 days, while the ice kept the world frozen, heating the iron over his stove and hammering it into the wood like surgical stitches, binding the crack shut. The process was slow, painful, his hands blistered from the cold metal, his fingers numb, but when it was done the groaning stopped. The tree settled back into its ancient silence. That near disaster remained unknown to the people of Mill Flat, but it planted a seed of uncertainty in Brian. If he had misjudged one more cut, the entire 3 winters of work could have collapsed on him. But the winter of 1877 was shaping up to be the hardest in Sierra memory, and the emergency had only just begun. On the second night after the ice storm, a stagecoach running the mountain road lost its way in a sudden whiteout. The driver, a man named Roscoe, had misread the trail markers and turned up a logging spur instead of the main pass. Inside the coach were 3 passengers, a schoolteacher named Florence, her infant daughter, and a gambler heading for San Francisco. The horses were failing, the cold was deadly, and they had no shelter except a few blankets. Roscoe remembered hearing about the Tree Man's strange house. It was their only chance. He unhitched the 2 remaining horses and led the passengers on foot, stumbling through waist-deep drifts toward the faint orange glow of a stovepipe far up the ridge. Brian saw the light from a lantern bobbing through the blizzard and knew immediately what it meant. The tree was supposed to be a home for one man and a dog. But now, strangers were coming, and the question wasn't just whether his staircase could hold them. It was whether the Sequoia that had withstood lightning and fire could also shelter the seeds of something far larger than a single life. The light appeared first as a faint wobbling smear against the total white of the blizzard, then as a distinct yellow orb swinging from a stagecoach conductor's fist. Brian stood in the tree entrance and watched it climb toward him through the drifts. Beside him, the dog let out a low growl, then fell silent, waiting on the master's cue. By the time Roscoe stumbled into the clearing with Florence, her infant, and the gambler Virgil, the temperature had dropped so far that breath froze before it left the mouth. The schoolteacher's shawl had stiffened into a shell of ice. The infant was quiet, a dangerous sign in a storm, and Virgil's waxed mustache was a solid white plank across his upper lip. None of them could speak coherently. Brian said nothing either. He simply stepped aside and let the hollow Sequoia swallow them whole. Inside, the change was almost violent. The stove's warmth enveloped them, and the baby immediately began to cry, a thin sound that was the best music Brian had heard in months. Florence wept silently while Roscoe collapsed onto the ash floor, gasping. Virgil the gambler stared upward into the dark, chimney-like void of the hollow trunk, watching the stovepipe smoke curl invisibly into the heights. The candlelight caught the carved spiral staircase ascending the wall, the storage platform piled with sacks and tools, the sleeping nook tucked beneath a natural arch of charred wood. "My God," Virgil whispered, "you built a hotel inside a dead giant." Brian knelt to stoke the fire. "It's not dead," he corrected. "It's been alive 3,000 years. The fire just gave it a new shape." The storm pinned them inside for the next 72 hours. Roscoe helped Brian carry up split pine from the wood stash while Florence fed her daughter on the lower platform. Virgil, who had never done a day of physical labor in his life, was put to work sanding the cracks in the staircase. He didn't complain. When a man's life depends on a structure, the structure suddenly becomes sacred. The dog, a thick-coated Malamute mix named Cove, lay across the baby's feet during the worst of the wind, breathing steady, radiating warmth, while Brian periodically climbed to the observation hole and scanned the white chaos for any sign that the tree itself was yielding. The hairline crack he had repaired held firm. The iron straps did their work. The Sequoia groaned only once, a deep bass note that shook the floor, then settled again. Brian clocked the sound and compared it mentally to every other groan he had logged over 3 winters. This was not structural. It was the tree breathing, adjusting to the weight of the snow loading its upper branches. It would hold. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared, and the world outside revealed itself in all its brutal brilliance. 4-foot drifts buried every wagon track on the lower road. A nearby prospector's cabin had collapsed under the weight, its roof split like matchwood. Roscoe stepped out first, looking back at the towering black column of the Sequoia still rising from the snow as if winter were irrelevant. "You don't need a fort," he muttered, half to himself. "You've got one already." Brian was already outside, digging a path to the spring. "That's the point," he said without turning. The passengers left with provisions from Brian's stores, and when they reached Mill Flat 3 days later, they told stories that nobody wanted to believe. Virgil the gambler described the tree in terms that made it sound like a drawing from the Arabian Nights. A multi-story mansion inside a living redwood, a staircase that twisted to a watchtower, a stove that burned wood you didn't have to split because the tree had shed it at your feet. Florence wrote a letter to her sister in Sacramento, which the sister passed to a newspaper editor. The editor printed it under the headline, "The Man Who Lives in a Sequoia." The ridicule that had defined Brian's reputation for 2 winters evaporated almost overnight. By the following autumn, 2 Swiss immigrants, a carpenter and his son, arrived at the tree with axes and a letter of introduction from the gambler himself. They asked if there was room to build. Brian stared at them for a long moment. The tree could only hold so many, but the land around it, the clearing, the ridge, the spring, that was capable of accommodating more. He pointed to a level spot 50 yards downslope. "Flat ground and good drainage," he said. "Knock yourselves out." Within a year there were 4 cabins clustered around the massive trunk, all built with timber felled from the surrounding forest. The settlers had no legal title. The land was part of an unclaimed swath of public domain between 2 Mexican land grants, and the nearest federal land office was 100 miles away. But they had water, game, and the tree. Especially the tree. In the winter of 1879, a second blizzard rolled through the Sierra, this one worse than the last. A party of 7 miners, caught in the storm while hauling silver ore from the high country, fled toward the only landmark they knew, the burning Sequoia with the stovepipe. They arrived half frozen. By then, the tree's lower chamber had been expanded, a second entrance carved on the leeward side to prevent drafts, a wider sleeping platform installed. Brian had even rigged a hand-cranked lift system from old wagon pulleys to haul supplies vertically from the base to the storage level. The miners crammed inside, and the tree's vast hollow, which had once felt cavernous to one man, now felt full. Too full. That was when the first serious tension emerged. A man named Hargrove, who owned the Mill Flat Saloon and considerable influence over the county's fledgling political apparatus, had been watching the tree settlement grow with a mixture of envy and alarm. Every traveler who stopped at the Sequoia meant one less paying customer in his establishment. The tree had become a free hotel, and Hargrove saw it siphoning off commerce that should have flowed through Mill Flat. He began whispering to county commissioners that Brian was operating a rogue tavern on unincorporated land, that the tree was a fire hazard, that the congregation of outsiders would bring disease and lawlessness. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter when profit was at stake. One afternoon in March of 1880, a deputy sheriff rode up to the Sequoia with a typed notice pinned to an envelope. The notice declared the structure an unsafe assembly under the county's newly adopted fire code, a code that no one had ever seen until that day, and ordered all non-resident occupants to vacate within 30 days. The deputy, a man with a weak chin and a borrowed badge, read it aloud while Brian stood in the entrance with a chisel in one hand and a dog at his side. The Swiss carpenter watched from his cabin door. The miners who had never left glared from the upper watch hole. Brian took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his coat pocket. "The tree stood here since before your county existed," he said. "It'll stand after your code is forgotten." The deputy rode away without another word, but the threat had landed. That night, the settlers gathered inside the tree's lower chamber. They sat in a circle on the ash floor, lantern light flickering across faces that were wind-burned and resolute. They represented a cross-section of the frontier. A failed farmer, a widowed seamstress, a German blacksmith, 2 teenage boys who had run from a workhouse, and Brian himself. They were not a town yet, but they were the seeds of one. And they quickly realized that Hargrove would not stop with a piece of paper. The Sequoia, which had withstood lightning and ice and the weight of centuries, now faced a new kind of enemy. The law, wielded by a man who had never spent a night in the wind. The pivot was clear. The tree had become more than a shelter. It had become a symbol, a claim on a future that someone else wanted to take from them. The following morning, Brian did something unexpected. He walked the 8 miles down to Mill Flat, entered the saloon, and stood before Hargrove. The room went quiet. The pine boards creaked. Brian placed a single coin on the bar, enough for a whiskey which he did not drink. "You've called my home a hazard," Brian said, voice low. "I'm here to ask what it would take for you to call it a town." Hargrove laughed, but the laugh died in his throat when he saw that Brian was not joking. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and was not witnessed by anyone, but when Brian left, Hargrove's face was the color of old flour. The next week, the county received a formal application for a post office, submitted under the name Sequoia Station. At the bottom of the page, Brian had drawn a diagram of the tree and its surrounding structures, labeling each building with the name of its occupant. It was a map of a town that, on paper, did not yet legally exist, and the county, bewildered by the sheer audacity of it, had no immediate grounds to refuse. But nature had not yet played its final card. In late autumn of 1881, an early season lightning storm swept through the Sierra. The same weather pattern that had birthed the Sequoia's hollow decades earlier returned with a fury. Lightning forked onto the ridge, and a nearby pine exploded into flames. The fire spread before anyone could react. By nightfall, the forest around Sequoia Station was burning, and the settlers scrambled toward the one structure they believed could save them: the tree. Brian organized the line, soaked blankets in the spring, and beat the flames away from the bark. The sequoia's thick cork-like skin was designed by nature to resist fire, the very trait that made it survive for millennia, and it did not catch. But the outer cabins were not sequoia. They were pine and tar. One of them, the blacksmith's shop, caught a flying ember and became an inferno. In the chaos, a burning limb crashed onto the roof of the Swiss carpenter's cabin, trapping his son. Brian ran toward the flames without hesitation. What he found in that burning structure would test not only his courage, but the entire premise of the community he had built. Because inside the trapped boy's pocket was a folded document none of them had seen before, a land patent from the General Land Office, dated 3 weeks earlier, listing John Hargrove as the registered owner of 800 acres, including the very ground beneath the tree. The crisis had just begun. The heat was a living thing inside the burning cabin. Brian found the boy, a 15-year-old named Otto, trapped beneath a fallen rafter, his leg pinned and his breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. The pocket of his coat was already smoldering, a black scorch spreading like ink across the wool. Brian grabbed the rafter with his bare hands and heaved. The wood did not move. He heaved again, legs braced, smoke blinding him, and this time the rafter shifted just enough for Otto to drag himself free. They stumbled out together into the snow-dusted clearing, coughing and half-blind, while the Swiss carpenter wept with relief. But Otto's coat was still burning. Brian tore it from the boy and stamped the flames into the dirt. As the wool fell open, a folded paper spilled out, heavy bond government stock, the kind used by federal land offices. Brian recognized the seal before he read the name. John Hargrove, 800 acres. Registered October 11th, 1881. 3 weeks ago. That night the settlers gathered in the hollow sequoia with the pat spread across a barrel head. The fire outside was still smoldering, but the mood inside was colder. Hargrove had used a legal loophole called a preemption claim, which allowed a settler who had improved government land to purchase it before anyone else could file. The problem was, Hargrove had never improved the land. He had never built, never farmed, never spent a single night on that ridge. To file the claim, he had fabricated a homestead narrative, a phantom cabin, a phantom garden, a phantom barn, and somehow gotten it past a complacent land office clerk named Fillmore, 70 miles away in the county seat. The tree settlers had no legal standing because they had never formalized their occupancy. They had simply existed. Now, on paper, they were squatters on another man's property. For the next 3 days, Brian did not sleep. He dissected the land patent with the same patience he had once applied to the sequoia's interior. He measured distances, cross-referenced the survey lines with a hand-drawn map Como had made years earlier marking the original Paiute Trail. Then he found the anomaly. The survey described an eastern boundary, commencing at a large granite outcropping known as Hanging Rock. But Hanging Rock, the true Hanging Rock, was a quarter-mile farther east than the survey plat indicated. The land office clerk had used a flawed cadastral sketch from 1872, prepared before the railroad corrected the township lines. As a result, Hargrove's filed claim either shifted onto land he didn't own, or failed to encompass the actual Sequoia site at all. The margin was narrow, less than 400 feet, but it was there. The tree might be sitting just outside the claim's legal boundary. Brian shared his finding only with the blacksmith, a man named Kruger who had lost his shop in the fire. Kruger studied the map, then nodded slowly. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need the one thing no one in Sequoia Station has." That statement hung in the air like smoke. They had no money for a lawyer. Hargrove had money, the saloon, the county commissioners. But Brian had something Hargrove did not. First-hand knowledge of the land, documented over years of carving, and an ally the saloonkeeper could never anticipate. A retired surveyor named Lester mostly lived 2 canyons over, in a tar paper shack with a collection of government maps that rivaled the county archives. Mosley had been drummed out of the General Land Office years earlier for refusing to approve fraudulent claims, exactly the sort of man Hargrove would have avoided. Brian walked the 12 miles to Mosley's door, carrying the patent, the map, and a gift of smoked venison. Mostly listened for 10 minutes without interruption. Then he pulled down 3 leather-bound survey folios from a shelf, uncorked a bottle of ink, and began reconstructing the township plat from original field notes. What he found over the following week would upend everything. Hargrove's patent not only mislocated the landmark, it also claimed a quarter section that had been set aside as school land under the Morrill Act of 1862, public land reserved for funding education, legally unavailable for private purchase. The patent was void on its face, but Hargrove had moved faster than anyone expected. Before Mosley could complete his report, a second sheriff's deputy, this one considerably less timid, arrived at the Sequoia with an eviction order. It was signed by a territorial judge named Whitlock, a man known to drink Hargrove's whiskey on credit. The order gave the settlers 48 hours to vacate the premises known as Sequoia Station and all appurtenant structures. The deputy posted it on the tree's bark with a nail. Brian watched him do it, then waited until the man had ridden out of sight before pulling the nail free and folding the order into his pocket. "We've got 2 days to prove the patent's a lie," he told the group, "or we lose everything." That night, under a clear sky and a sliver of moon, the settlers executed a plan that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The widow seamstress, a woman named Miriam who had become the community's unofficial record keeper, wrote a telegram to the General Land Office in Washington, D.C., setting forth the anomalies Mosley had found. But the nearest telegraph office was in Mill Flat, inside Hargrove's own saloon. The blacksmith's teenage apprentice, a wiry boy named Ellis, volunteered to go down alone after midnight, climb the wall of the back storeroom, and transmit the message from the night operator's key while he slept. It was a crime. It was also the only path. Ellis made it to Mill Flat at 2 in the morning. The saloon was dark, but the telegraph office, a small room adjacent to the bar, had a window that didn't fully latch. He eased it open, slipped inside, and sat before the brass key with shaking hands. He had learned Morse from a railroad lineman the year before, one of the travelers who had sheltered in the tree. He tapped the message with painstaking care. T.O. Land Office, Washington, D.C. Urgent request, suspend patent number 472, section 38, township 9, range 24, fraudulent survey evidence to follow. Before he could receive an acknowledgement, a floorboard creaked behind him. It was Hargrove's night barman. Ellis bolted through the window and ran into the dark, the barman shouting after him. But the message had already gone through. The next morning, Hargrove knew, not from the barman he hadn't caught Ellis, but from a response that arrived in Mill Flat at dawn. Suspension pending investigation. Await inspector arrival. Hargrove recognized immediately that his plot was unraveling. He dispatched a rider to Judge Whitlock, urging him to expedite the eviction before any federal inspector could arrive. Whitlock obliged. A posse of 6 men, some of them Hargrove's saloon regulars, was assembled to forcibly remove the settlers if necessary. They would ride out at noon. The settlers, meanwhile, had only hours. Brian gathered them inside the tree one last time. The staircase spiraled above them, the candlelight dancing on the ancient charred walls, the dog cove lying quietly as if he understood the gravity. Brian looked at the faces around him. The Swiss carpenter, the blacksmith, the seamstress, the boys, the miners who'd never left, and he said the simplest words he had ever spoken. "We're not leaving." Then he began assigning tasks. Kruger and his son hauled heavy iron straps from the wreckage of the blacksmith's shop and began bolting a heavy timber door across the lower entrance, one that could be barred from inside. The miners stacked cordwood as a secondary barrier. Miriam organized the children and the elderly on the upper sleeping platform with water and provisions. Ellis, the telegraph boy, was sent to the ridge with a signal lantern. If the posse came, he would flash a warning. Brian himself took position at the upper observation hole, alone with a rifle he had not fired in years, watching the trail. At noon, the posse appeared. 6 riders, led by the deputy and a man named Grimes, a former buffalo hunter with a reputation for violence. They reined up at the edge of the clearing and stared at the Sequoia. The heavy timber door was unmistakable. The tree had become a fortress. Grimes cupped his hands and shouted, By order of the territorial court, you are to vacate these premises immediately. Come out unarmed and no one gets hurt. Silence. Then Brian's voice, calm and echoing from high in the trunk, replied, "This land is not his. The patent's a fraud and Washington knows it. You're enforcing a lie." Grimes spat. "I got a court order that says different. You got 1 hour." What Grimes did not know was that a second rider was already approaching from the opposite direction, having avoided the main trail. It was Lester Mosley, the surveyor, accompanied by Como, who had guided him over the back ridge. They had in their possession a certified copy of the original survey plat from 1871, the one that clearly placed the Sequoia outside Hargrove's claimed boundaries. Mosley, wheezing from the climb, stumbled into the clearing just as the posse was preparing to dismount. He held the document aloft like a shield. "This eviction is unlawful," he shouted. "I am a former deputy surveyor of the United States General Land Office. The patent is void, the land is reserved school property, and any man who aids this seizure is committing a federal offense." The deputy froze. Grimes turned and saw the document, then looked at the Sequoia with its barred door and its rifle at the watch hole. He calculated the odds: a federal charge, a possible inspector already en route, a tree full of armed people willing to die. He was a hired hand, not a zealot. After a long, tense minute, he raised his hand and signaled the posse to retreat. "This isn't over," he muttered to no one in particular. Then they rode away. That evening, the federal land inspector, a stern man named Arthur Clay, arrived at Mill Flat. He had received the telegram, then traveled by rail and horseback for 3 days straight. He interviewed Mosley, examined the documents, and within 24 hours issued his preliminary finding. The patent was irregular to the point of presumptive fraud. Hargrove, cornered, did something desperate. He burned his own saloon's records and attempted to flee toward Nevada. He was intercepted by a marshal at the state line. The Sequoia and its surrounding community had survived the legal assault, but the ordeal had transformed them. No longer a loose collection of squatters, they now understood themselves as a town in waiting. The post office application that Brian had filed months earlier was quietly approved. The name Sequoia Station became official. A town plat was drawn with the tree at its center, recorded in the county as the first lot. Parcel number 1, Sequoia. The blacksmith rebuilt his shop. A general store opened. The Swiss carpenter's son, Otto, recovered and began carving his own staircase in a second hollow tree nearby, a younger Sequoia that lightning had struck the year of his rescue. The village had taken root in the shadow of a giant that had seen 3 millennia, but the final test of its endurance was still to come, not from men, but from the earth itself. Because one night in the late spring of 1882, after an unusually heavy rain, the ground beneath the original hollow Sequoia began to shift. A subterranean spring, never before active, had been awakened by the saturation, and its waters were eroding the soil around the tree's root crown. The ancient giant, stable for centuries, suddenly tilted. The staircase that Brian had spent 3 winters carving began to crack. The tree that had become a home, a shelter, and a symbol was now threatening to collapse from the very ground that had always held it. And Brian knew, with a certainty that went deeper than science, that saving the town would mean saving the tree first. The groan came low and deep, like a sleeping beast stirring for the first time in centuries. Brian felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard it, a vibration rising from the floor of the hollow Sequoia, climbing the carved staircase, rattling the candle lanterns. He grabbed the iron handrail and froze. The tilt was barely perceptible at first, maybe 2 degrees, but enough to send a wooden cup rolling across the platform and over the edge into darkness. Cove, the dog, let out a whine that was half fear and half question. Outside, the settlers who had been rebuilding the blacksmith shop stopped their hammers and looked toward the tree with faces suddenly drained of color. The giant was moving. Brian descended the staircase slower than he ever had, reading the cracks in the wood with the same focus he once applied to drift patterns. The old hairline fissure he'd stitched with iron straps was still sealed, but new ones had appeared, thin white fractures running horizontally along the inner bark, signs that the tree's entire center of balance was shifting. Outside, he found the source. A seep of water, dark and cold, was bubbling up from the ground at the tree's base, muddying the snowmelt with silt. The subterranean spring that had slept beneath the ridge for maybe 10,000 years had awakened. It was eroding the soil around the root crown, liquefying the very foundation that held a 300-foot column upright. Como arrived before anyone sent for him. The old Paiute had been watching the sky and the land, and he'd noticed the sudden wetness in a place that had always been dry. He stood beside Brian, looking down at the muddy water, then up at the massive trunk that now leaned ever so slightly north. "Water wants to find its own level," Como said. "If it cannot go down, it will spread sideways and take everything with it." Brian understood immediately. The spring had no natural outlet. The granite bedrock formed a bowl directly beneath the sequoia's roots. Unless they could give the water a way out, it would keep saturating the soil until the tree toppled like a felled monument. What followed was a race that lasted 5 days and tested the community as nothing had before. Brian mapped the underground flow by driving metal rods into the earth and marking where they came up wet. Mostly, the surveyor still staying with them, helped triangulate the contours of the bedrock. Kruger, the blacksmith, forged a set of heavy iron drain pipes from scrap wagon axles. The Swiss carpenter and his son Otto, still limping but fierce with determination, framed a trench that would run from the uphill side of the spring, around the tree's root zone, and downslope toward a natural swale. Every able-bodied person dug with shovels and picks, even the gambler Virgil who had returned months ago as a permanent resident. His San Francisco dreams traded for a cabin within sight of the Sequoia. He worked until his soft hands bled. No one complained. The tree had saved them from blizzards, from fire, from the law. Now they would save the tree. On the third day, with the trench half dug, the ground shifted again. A section of the staircase near the middle platform splintered with a sound like a rifle volley. Brian was inside, bracing the inner walls with heavy pine beams when it happened. A shard of ancient wood the size of a man's arm shot past his face and buried itself in the opposite wall. He didn't flinch. He simply called for more beams and continued wedging them between the floor and ceiling, distributing the new pressure across the intact ribs of the trunk. He knew the tree's internal architecture now better than he knew his own body. Every knot, every grain, every fire scar that could either hold or fail. He placed the braces according to a logic he could feel but not explain, and when the fourth day dawned, the creaking had stopped. The tilt had not worsened. The drainage trench was finished that afternoon. Kruger laid the iron pipes into the cut, and the first clear water rushed through them with a musical clatter, pouring into the swale and away from the roots. Within hours, the muddy seep at the base began to recede. The soil firmed. The tree, still leaning those 2 degrees north, settled into a new equilibrium, not perfectly upright but stable, its million-pound mass now safely anchored again. The staircase, repaired and reinforced, held for the first time in a week without a groan. Brian climbed to the observation hole and looked out over the settlement. The cabins were standing. The people were still there. The Sequoia was still alive, still sending smoke from its stovepipe straight into the cold Sierra sky. That spring, something shifted in the way the outside world viewed Sequoia Station. The story of the town that had defended itself against a fraudulent land claim, and then against the very ground beneath its feet, spread through the region in the way that only fireside stories can. More travelers arrived, some looking for shelter, others looking to stay. The post office that Brian had fought for became a real building, with Miriam the seamstress appointed as the first postmistress. She hung a painted sign above the door, Sequoia, California. The word station fell away quietly as if the place had outgrown it. Families built homes. A school was established in a cabin the Swiss carpenter framed with his own hands. Otto, now fully healed, took over his father's trade and began carving his own tree house in the younger Sequoia, a project that would take him 7 years. But the deepest truth of the town's identity remained the original Sequoia itself. Every winter, when the Sierra storms turned the trail into a white death trap, stranded travelers would follow the smell of wood smoke to the dark tower on the ridge. They came as they had before, Stagecoach drivers, miners, a traveling preacher, a family of 5 fleeing a failed homestead. Brian never turned anyone away. The hollow chamber, once the solitary home of one man and his dog, now had 3 finished levels connected by that spiral staircase, storage and workshops below, a communal sleeping platform with a stove and a library of donated books in the middle, and a watch post at the very top where anyone could sit and see the entire valley. On the worst nights of the year, 60 people would shelter inside the tree, their bodies warming the ancient wood, their conversations drifting up the fluted chimney like incense. The Sequoia had become what Brian once imagined, a living hotel, a fortress of bark, a town within a tree. And then in the winter of 1890 came the storm that would make that truth permanent. A blizzard unlike any in living memory hit the central Sierra, closing every pass and burying every road under 15 feet of snow. Mill Flat, the settlement down the canyon that had been the seat of Hargrove's power, was cut off entirely. But Sequoia, perched on its ridge and shielded by its giant, had become the only functioning way station for 50 miles in any direction. A wagon train of 27 people, bound for the Central Valley, became trapped on the road and crawled toward the tree in a desperate column, guided by the lantern in the observation hole. They were Italian immigrants, farmers from the Piedmont who spoke little English and had never seen a tree so large that a house could live inside it. Brian met them at the entrance with hot broth and blankets, and the Sequoia swallowed them all. That winter, the town's population doubled in a single week. When spring arrived, many of those immigrants chose not to leave. They built new cabins, planted gardens, opened a bakery. The village grew outward in concentric rings, just as the tree's own rings had grown for 3,000 years. By the turn of the century, Sequoia had a church, a one-room schoolhouse, a doctor, and a name that appeared on county maps. The original tree still stood at the center of it all, leaning slightly north, its staircase worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Brian, now an old man with a white beard and hands that could no longer grip a chisel, spent his final years sitting on a bench carved into the tree's entrance, watching the life he had started swirl around him. Cove's offspring, now 3 generations of Malamutes, slept at his feet. One afternoon, a young reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, having heard of the remarkable town, arrived to write a feature. He asked Brian what had possessed him, alone in that hollow trunk during that first winter, to keep carving upward when everyone else called him a fool. Brian looked at the staircase spiraling into the shadows above, then at the children playing in the clearing, then at the reporter. "I wasn't carving a home," he said quietly. "I was carving a door for everyone the storm would ever catch alone." The reporter wrote that line down and called it the best quote of the year. The tree still stands today. The town of Sequoia no longer exists under that name. It was absorbed into a larger township in the 1940s, but the giant Sequoia remains, tilted and scarred and alive, its staircase still climbable, its heart still hollow and warm. Wood smoke still rises from its crown on cold winter nights. And if you stand inside at the base and look up, you can see the faint marks of a chisel, following the grain, climbing into darkness, carved there by a man who believed that a storm, once exhausted, could become a foundation. Not for one life, for an entire town. Brian carved a staircase inside the burnt heart of a giant, but somewhere along the way, he carved something far larger, a truth that the frontier often forgot. The wilderness does not punish audacity as cruelly as it punishes the refusal to adapt. A hollow tree, mocked as a dead man's coffin, became a warm cradle for the living because one man looked at a scar and saw a shelter. Then others looked at one man and saw a possibility. What happened at Sequoia was not an isolated miracle. Across the West, similar stories played out in miniature. Drifters finding refuge in sandstone caves, stranded families wintering inside abandoned mine shafts, whole communities clustering around a single reliable spring. The difference at Sequoia was that the refuge was alive, still growing, still breathing, even after lightning tried to kill it. The tree and the town became one organism, roots tangling with foundations, bark outlasting every wooden cabin that circled it. And the staircase, the original staircase that took 3 winters of bruised knuckles and frozen breath, became the axis around which a community turned. Yet the question that hums beneath the story is the same one that faces anyone who builds something unconventional in a world that prefers straight lines. Was Brian a genius of frontier engineering, or simply stubborn enough to survive long enough to be called one? His design was not taught in any school. It was taught by watching how wind moved through a canyon, how snow piled against a rock, how fire hollowed the heartwood but left the bark alive. He read the tree, and then he read the land, and then he read the law, and finally he read the moment when a group of desperate strangers needed to believe that a home could be built inside something that had already died on the outside. It is tempting to call it luck. But luck doesn't spend 3 winters chiseling a staircase inside a charred cavity while the nearest town laughs. Luck doesn't strap iron across a crack in the middle of a blizzard, or file a post office application under a name that doesn't yet exist on any map, or stare down a posse with a voided land patent and a 48-hour eviction deadline. What Brian did was not luck. It was a kind of radical patience, a belief that the same forces that destroy can also be diverted, exhausted, domesticated by shape and by will. The storm never stopped coming to the Sierra. Winters still bury the high passes, and the wind still snaps pine trunks like matchsticks. But the giant sequoia still stands, tilted 2 degrees north, its staircase still climbable, its hollow still sheltering those who know where to find it. And if you walk inside today and place your hand against the charred inner wall, you can feel the chisel marks, each one a small defiance. One man asked the storm where it would break, and then he gave it a place to rest. That place became a town. So the real question is not whether one man could live inside a tree. It's how many of us would have the patience to listen to the things that scare us, long enough to turn them into a foundation. Would you? Subscribe and join us for more stories of those who did.